Well, first of all, welcome to all of you. Thanks for attending this first session of our new reading group on silence. It is indeed a pleasure for us to have Dr. Ronald Blankenborg as our first speaker. He is assistant professor in ancient literature and linguistics at Radboud University in Nijmegen. He's working on obviously Homer and especially as far as I can see, the problems related to silence, pauses, and audible punctuation, and has a book out on this topic in 2021. And he's going to talk to us about a fascinating topic, and the title is Visible Silence, Choosing Between Punctuation and Phonology.
Thank you, Domenico, for your introduction. And thank you for having me in this first session on silence. Let's start. It stems from tradition, as we have it, that the Dactylic Hexameter lays claim to being the measure of permanency and the voice of the divine, as it is the metrical format of the dactylic poetry of ancient Greek epic, wisdom literature, and of metrical inscriptions. In Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, both roughly around 800 BC, the muse is politely summoned with a hexametric proem, and she delivers her account of wrath or nostos in hexameters. The proem by the poet is prosodically identical to the epic narrative it introduces. Thus, the entire epic narrative counts as the words of the inspiring goddess, or at least as long as the series of Stygic dactylic hexameters continues. Epic language is the language of the gods and transcends the transience of human existence in various ways. It is the vehicle for the expression of kleos avtiton, imperishable fame, and continues to function as such beyond the pinnacle of Homer's poetry and its contemporaries. The dactylic hexameter, used endlessly in a row in archaic Greek epic, is a rather long verse consisting of a minimum of 12 and a maximum of 17 syllables, with a main caesura, a recurring word end, around the middle of the line. The syllables are arranged in 6 metrical feet, each of which consists of a so-called long syllable, followed by either 2 short syllables or, alternatively, another long syllable. On number 1 on the handout, I present the Iliad's first line as an example. If a foot consists of long, short, short, it is called dactylic. If long, long, it is labeled spondaic. The verse's final foot is always spondaic. The first final syllable is metrically indifferent and rhythmically indeterminate, hence indicated with the symbol X. In a rhythmical rendering of the hexameter, where the foot's first long syllable is pronounced as rhythmically heavy and the remainder of the foot as rhythmically light, a hexameter sounds like number 2 on the handout. So a hexameter sounds like dum diddy dum diddy dum diddy dum diddy dum diddy dum dum. The Iliad features nearly 15,000 hexameters, and the Odyssey, an epic presumably composed roughly a generation later, possibly by the same poet, Homer, counts 12,000 verses. As a performer needs to pause when performing a passage from an epic poem, the question presents itself: where? It has proven tempting to assume that verse end is the perfect place to pause, to allow for a quick breath or even for silence of a certain duration. As Greek scholars from antiquity are remarkably silent with regard to the pauses in the hexameter, later scholars, starting from Buck's notion of colometry and period, have identified pauses based on the hexameter's repetitive shape. Daitz, referring to Cicero, assumes that pauses are to be observed at verse end, and preferably not within the line. Naj, identifying prosodic markings in a Bacchylides papyrus, teaches his students, as you have read, to pause at verse end and, if necessary, at the main caesura. Steinrück, looking for the frequency of word end at specific verse internal positions, argues for the identification of main and auxiliary caesurae at positions of frequent word end. Roughly 5 types of pauses are identified. The first type we have already encountered with Daitz and Naj, the metrical pause at the end of the line and, if applicable, within the line. On the number 3 of the handout, I have indicated a few different positions in different lines, indicating possible positions for metrical pause. The numbers that you will find in superscript are the metrical positions within the line. The second type of pause is the rhythmical pause. It is based on colometry, as you have read it in Steinrück. Here on the number 4 on the handout, I present an example of one line from the Iliad, divided roughly following the rhythmical pauses from colon to colon, separated by pauses. The third type of pause is based on syntax. It's a common sense pause, hence abbreviated SP, as evidenced in Bakker's well-known chunking of the Iliad's first lines. Here on the number 5 of the handout, I present the chunking of the lines by Bakker, the first 7 lines of the Iliad, and the chunking is done by means of sense pauses from unit to unit. The idea is that every sense pause moves on to a next unit of meaning. In a translation, that's here, in a translation, we can make this visible, and I leave it to you to judge if these are indeed the units of meaning. The fourth pause type is based on phonology and on the way lexical and non-lexical words and phrases lean onto each other to form larger coherent wholes that cannot be broken by pauses. This fourth type forbids pause rather than allowing for pauses. The metrical bridges, positions in the hexameter where word end is not permitted, are the direct result of this approach of pause. Here on the number 6, I present an example, one line from the Iliad, 148, where there is no pause in the middle of the line, since the preposition apanaute, at a certain distance from, leans on the lexical word neion, the ships. The word group apanaute neion, at a certain distance from the ships, cannot be broken. The final type of pause, phonetic pause, identifies pause as termination of phonation, generally assumed at verse end because of the verse final indifferent syllable. An example on the number 7 on the handout, a line followed by breathing. As pause implies termination of phonation anyway. Phonetic pause is the sought-for pause in performance. I will argue that more positions of such pause may be found within rather than at the end of the verse. All the different levels of analysis lead to a complete representation of the hexameter, and here on the handout I present it under number 8. A presentation of the hexameter in feet, structural elements, positions, metrical realizations, line 1.1 from the Iliad as an example, and subsequently the same line again presented following all the different layers. That verse end allows for pause is sufficiently evidenced by various factors. The inevitability of word end at verse end, the metrical indifference of the verse final syllable, and the custom, starting from the 3rd century BCE, to render epic poetry as stygic verse, 1 hexameter per line in writing. At the same time, all these indicators do not automatically imply that verse end is always realized as a pause in performance. They did result, however, in the use of the isolated hexameter both within and outside the hexametric context. Within epic poetry, the hexameter further developed into the isolated authoritative saying, heralding or signaling its use beyond epic for the sustainability and immortalization of deeds, doers, and monuments. Their prosodic format makes the sayings sounds as divinely inspired and the performer as the god's mouthpiece. Examples are found in the dactylic poetry of Homer's alleged contemporary Hesiod, a Boeotian poet known for his didactic poetry. In his Theogony, he describes the origin of the gods, their genealogy, and the theological supremacy of Zeus. In Works and Days, he admonishes his good-for-nothing brother with a mix of exemplary rural activity in accordance with nature's calendar, moralizing mythical stories and proverbial sayings. That his words too are meant as the language of the gods becomes famously explicit in Theogony lines 22 to 34. The poet claims to have encountered the muses and to henceforth function as their mouthpiece. Hesiod exploits the shape of the hexameter for a combination of riddle and answer, as I here present in 2 examples under number 9 on the handout. The second half of the hexameter, containing the answer, develops into a separate metrical phrase, the perimiac, technical term, a catalectic anapestic dimeter, eventually singled out as the prosodic shape for wisdom sayings. For the pauses within the line, the first clues that we are looking for come from the alleged prehistory of the hexameter. The hexameter itself may well have been inherited by the Greek poets together with the notion of monumentality through poetic imperishable fame, as Naj claims. There is no consensus, however, on the origin of the hexameter. Naj states that the hexameter originally operated on an inherited principle of isosyllabism, as do the Aeolic meters. Isosyllabism implies that a line of poetry is built from a fixed number of syllables, rather than a fixed amount of quantities, like longs and shorts. Nij's conjectured prototype of Greek epic verse matches the syllable count of the basic unit of Indic versification, the sloka. Kiparski explains the hexameter as an iambic derivation, a syncopated realization of the quantitative iambic octosyllabic dimeter. The iambic octosyllable, the basic Indo-European line, as Kiparski calls it, and functioning in dimeter distichs by a fusion process that began already in Vedic, is also deemed the most likely vehicle of Indo-European epic verse. In their introduction, Becker and Lidoff, in the forthcoming handbook on Greek and Latin meter, refrain from comments concerning the hexameter's origin. But we cannot, since the origin of the hexameter and its application to ancient Greek epic verse interrelate against the background of theories involving oral composition, dictation, and tradition. In the process of ancient Greek's epic genesis, the stygic hexameter may possibly not have been there from the very first beginning. It definitely came out of the process as the only viable prosodic shape for epic and wisdom poetry. Theories on the genesis of ancient Greek epic, Iliad and Odyssey in particular, differ. Having been performed for centuries, they were eventually written down, possibly in a version that differed considerably from the Iliad and the Odyssey as they are known today. Dictation theory holds that at a certain moment, end of the 8th century BC, possibly later, the monumental poet dictated the Iliad and the Odyssey to a scribe at a festival. Jensen claims that this single recording took place in 522 BC. Up until this first material fixation, the writing down, both epics supposedly changed with every performance. The composing poet had and took the opportunity to add and remove word groups, whole lines, and passages. West envisages the Iliad and Odyssey in this phase as resembling epulia, self-contained episodes that might or might not be understood to have a definite place in a larger context. In his view, there is every reason to suppose that the epulion was what an epic singer commonly, even usually, performed, much like the performance of two songs in the Trojan War by Demodocus in the Odyssey, on the number 10 on the handout. I have indicated the passages. Much like that, the monumental poet was the exception to the rule. Frequency and occasion of performances remain a matter of guesswork, both for the period before and immediately after the first material fixation. Alternatively, Naj's evolutionary model describes the development of the monumental Iliad and Odyssey not as a historical accident, but as a gradual process, with the aid of writing as an equivalent to performance. Existing transcripts of particularly successful performances served as the basis for recomposition. From the first material fixation, the narrative of the Iliad and the Odyssey thus continued to expand due to the interaction of orality and literacy. The Homeric epic kept being orally performed, and the performance reliance on writing enabled them to continue composing and recomposing with the aid of material already written down. The recurrence of distinctive words, word groups, or items, sometimes thousands of lines apart, thus becomes a matter of deliberate reuse, rather than, as I cited under number 11 on the handout, independent withdrawals from the great oral credit bank. Some fluidity of the text of the Iliad and the Odyssey remained. Ancient scholars felt free to add, criticize, and remove lines well until the 2nd century BC. Evidence from papyri shows that the written text of the Iliad and the Odyssey reflects variance in performance until the 1st century BC. Throughout this process, the hexameter remained or developed into epic's persistent prosodic format. There are various clues pointing at the probability that epic's hexameter was not inherited from the Indo-European tradition in its current format. Metrical archaic inscriptions are proof of the process that eventually led to the hexameter. Rhythmical regularisation and written punctuation show that the metrical unity, primarily the hexameter, served as a unit of written communication before it doubled as a composition unit. Meter's applicability as a tool for composition and recomposition reflected the aesthetic appeal of dactylic rhythm. Examples of archaic inscriptions strengthen the intuition for later dactylic re-rhythmicizing in literary texts. Under number 12 on the handout, I present a few examples that feature run-over composition, but with full regard for the hexameter. These 3 archaic metrical inscriptions consist of a hexameter plus something extra. The inscriptions, as Friedlander puts it, vary among hexameter, prose, and hybrid forms. Alternatively, on the number 13 on the handout, inscriptions feature parts of hexameters and are then combined with prose, or rather logoedic elements. The inscription on the number in the inscription on the number 13, the first 7 syllables make a hexametric hemistich, a half verse, up until the trochaic caesura. The next 7 syllables constitute the hexametric clausula, starting from the heptamemeral caesura, as if the phrase between the metrical positions 5.5 and 7 is absent. In early Greek epic, we witness the same cognitive processing of chunks. For example, the filling of the metrical phrase between positions 5.5 and 7 with extra clausal constituents, as in the example under number 14 on the handout. The transitional constituent su men exactly fills the space between metrical position 5.5 and 7. The resulting colometry fuels the intuition that the hexameter resulted from combining 2 hemistich cola, 2 half-verse cola, an intuition that is strengthened by the hexameter's mid-metron main diaeresis. Nonetheless, the re-rhythmization of the hexameter into a sequence of 6 metra rather than a combination of 2 cola seems to predate Homer. In his 2005 article, Steinrück, as many others, ascribes the smoothing over of both the textual transmission and the prosodic metron shaping of Homer's hexameters to the scholarly tradition. But at the same time, he points at irregularities that survived the process. He points at the various examples of lagaroi, hexameters consisting of a hemiepes plus an enoplion. They are limping skadzon with a single short syllable in the second half of the third foot, a single short syllable instead of 2. Comparing the manuscripts with testimonia, papyri, and scholia brings to light alternative verses. On the number 15 of the handout, I present the alternative verses, all under Iliad, Book 19, verse 189. The letter Minneto autitheos perepegomenos perareos visualizes Didymus's comment that per is used in simpler texts, whereas better editions visualize the necessary silence after theos with written punctuation. This is in a scholion on Odyssey 3:230. On the number 16 of the handout, I present the complete scholion and the translation. Theos, it says, means for so long, for some time. It should be understood without the per and punctuated with a short pause after the theos for clarity and so that the meter be maintained through the silence of 1 mora. The mora is the duration of a single short syllable. The silence is thus calculated at 1 mora, the duration of the short syllable, a unit of measurement found in, for example, the description of pause by Nicanor, the scholiast, also known as the punctuator. Various means are applied to mend the metrical irregularity in comparable cases. I present a few here on the number 17 on your handout. Under these means to mend the metrical irregularity, we find addition of an extra iota to the ending of the dative plural. We find insertion of particles, as we already did with per, lengthening of vowels, and synthesis, taking vowels together into a single sound. The lagaroi, the limping hexameters, with single shorts instead of double shorts, are well attested in inscriptions. And under number 18 on the handout, can I get them? Yeah, I can get them both on the screen. I present two examples of such limping metrical inscriptions, both with one short syllable missing. Other metrical irregularities, verses that are called maiuros, with a light 6-foot thesis instead of a long syllable, and the akephalos, with a light first-foot thesis instead of a long syllable, are comparable phenomena. And I present two examples on the number 19 of the handout, both beginning with the word epei, both beginning with a short syllable on the thesis of the first foot, e, instead of a long syllable, as metrically required. They are comparable phenomena, though pointing, I would argue, at ankipetia, elements that may be realized as either long or short, rather than colometric joints. The examples on the 19 may both reflect original isosyllabi. The examples show that the original hexameter allowed for pause, both for breathing and as a true silence, through phonetic means. The rhythmical flow of the hexameter and the properties of natural speech acts facilitated pause and silence. The latter means, for examples, that speaker's tempo of speech or pace slows down towards the end of an utterance, a natural phenomenon that coincides with the chunking of speech and syntactical pausing, a direct result of the tendency of speakers to organize their speech in rhythmical spurts, phonologically and intonationally, coherent units of speech that correlate with syntactically coherent phrases. This audible punctuation in the hexameter, the natural speech pauses facilitated by prosody, have been obfuscated by the smoothing over of the text's format, away from a shape that reflects the units of sense and performance, and towards a regularization into a sequence of 6 metra of identical and repetitive shape, a sequence itself demarcated by indicators of line end that have been understood as markers of pause, breathing, or silence in performance. Audible punctuation may thus be found in phonetic considerations, themselves difficult to identify in a phonologically smoothed over text. Phonology and phonetics correlate more or less like meter and rhythm. The latter is the ontological reason behind the former. Meter tries to organize and represent visually what rhythm inherently contributes to the production and perception of language audibly. To find pause and silence, we have to turn to the phonetics of termination of phonation. Aristotle already stressed the importance of termination's phonetics. On the number 20 on the handout, he states, the strong pause ought to be introduced by a long syllable and the end clearly marked, not by the scribe, nor by a punctuation mark, but by the rhythm. The ancient rhythmicoi described the phonetic phenomenon earlier referred to as the lengthening of a final syllable. The additional lengthening of the word final syllable, toner in Greek, is partly due to assimilation of the phonetic pause to the word final syllable. Aristides Quintilianus adds that the prosodic realization of syllables does not only depend on their metrical position, light or heavy, but on their position within the word as well. Word final position results in additional lengthening of both light and heavy word final syllables. At word end, lengthening is described as diastasis, the terminology on the number 21 of the handout, separation, and kainos chronos, empty unit of time. Other terminology indicating the same phenomenon is metaxochronos, in between time, chronos mesos, middle unit of time, and siope, silence, or rather, I would say, sound stop. None of our sources explicitly says so, but it is tempting to assume that such terminology indicates a true pause of measurable duration. Dionysius of Halicarnassus comments on audible pause as phonetic disturbance, terminology on the number 22 of the handout. The reset of durations, the anabolechronon, is caused by a clashing of syllables, an anakopesolabon, that is the result of blockades formed by articulate sounds, antisteric moigrammaton. Armed with these phonetic tools and indicators, we may engage both hexametric poetry and poetry in one of the other 71 identified metrical phrases of ancient Greek poetry. Back to our hexameters. Why is all this important? Phraseology is another way to evidence the importance for us to find out the consequentiality of clause formation and metrical regularization. The assumption of pause at the boundaries of the period and the hemistich have led to further assumptions concerning emphasis and effective prosody based on the repetition of the hexameter. Whereas the frequency of enjambment in Homeric epic testifies to a composition date before the rhythmical dactylic regularization, it is often treated as a persistently exploited poetic effect, without denying the possibility of such effective prosody, beautiful and convincing examples of which have been presented in well-known studies. The majority of instances of enjambment, including harsh enjambment and mot enragé, are not emphatic at all, but examples of regular, out-of-line composition. And I know that it is difficult to read them at this pace, but I did gather a few examples of non-effective prosody in case of enjambment in the Homeric epic under number 23 of the handout. And there are many, many, many more, but this is just to give you an idea. Consider, I would suggest, also the extent to which clause formation ignores the metrically emphatic positions and simply continues from one line into the next. A few extra examples under number 24 on the handout. It seems safe, I would say, and with that I would like to conclude that rhythmical regularization postdates clausal composition. Thank you for your attention.
So thank you very much for this very fascinating presentation, on the system, on silence in the Greek hexameter. Perhaps I can start with a sort of quick question about, about the reasons of this phonological smoothing over. So why do you think that sort of later readers or editors, felt the need to sort of, kind of obscure this aspect,
yeah. That is an interesting question. If I state that they did, I must have thought, of course, about the reasons behind this, behind this smoothing over of the phonology. Let me state first, or let me repeat first, that this smoothing over of both the text and the meter, possibly first the meter and then the text with it, has been done so thoroughly that the Iliad and the Odyssey together present us with nearly 27,000 flawless hexameters. So it has been done very well. And the process has actually been continued, of course, in later hexametric poetry, both Greek and in Latin. The reason for smoothing over the hexameter must be found somewhere in a phase where the hexameter was no longer considered a build-up of either phrases or metrical phrases or cola, but that the hexameter itself was considered the basic unit of poetry, regardless of the fact that at that point, I assume, phenomena like the lagaroi, like the limping feet every here and there, were still present, as we can find them in the ancient archaic inscriptions. So the hexameter itself was considered a metrical unit. As such, of course, it is quite a large metrical unit, only to be compared to the longer Aeolic verses. We have a few, of course, that might be seen either as built upon a basic frame, like a long, short, short, long, somewhere in the middle of the line, or longer lines that may be seen as metrical unities in themselves. The hexameter clearly is a metrical unity in itself. And I think that was the main reason why it was so logical.
Sorry. No, sorry.
I think that must have been at some point the main reason why it seems so logical to smooth over everything internally within the hexameter.
I was more thinking whether there might be some sort of difference between the kind of performance, of an hexameter and the written version where, sort of counting, the syllables become more prominent. And the further sort of follow-up question, and I'll sort of, ask if there are more questions, would be how much can we sort of, why do you think, what is the source of information of these grammarians and philologists who basically comment on Homer and they inform us, of these pauses? How do you think they know that there's a pause right there, that you should sort of supply this mora because there's a silence and you should sort of, to presuppose that? Why do you think that they say it? Just because of their metrical knowledge, or because they have some knowledge of the performance, of the Homeric poems in some ways? What do you think it's happening, with that?
Well, I wish that we had some more sources on the actual performance of the text. It seems that we cannot get much closer than, in our case, Plato's Ion, where Socrates discusses the performance of Homeric poetry with a rhapsode. Unfortunately, of course, they discuss the content of the poetry and whether or not it makes the rhapsode an expert in the matters that he recites. And unfortunately, they do not speak of the impact of poetry. What does it make the audience feel like? What is the actual impact of reciting this poetry? And since we have no comments at all on where to find the pauses, or if you wish, the silence in the performance of the poetry, well, that is not until late antiquity, because there we find the first, but of course these are influenced by the practice of the centuries preceding that, and not the Greek practice, not the archaic Greek practice. All we can do, I fear, is search the text as Steinrück did, search the text for these possibly phonetic markers as they show up in phonology. Personally, I think that there are a few more. I mean, here we are, and we have, of course, an hour to discuss these matters, but I think that we can find several other phonological markers of originally phonetic phenomena within the line. Just to mention one, and this is one that sources from antiquity at least comment on, I would like to point at, but of course I know that this is slightly expert, so those who do not really know the hexametric line may feel like I'm trying to just drop names or terminology, but it's not like that. But we have Wernicke's law, and Wernicke's law states that despite the observation that the fourth foot of the hexameter cannot feature word end in a spondee, no word end in long. This word end does occur, and it might be explained by saying that the words used at these positions must be used at these positions since they cannot be accommodated anywhere else in the line, except maybe at line end. So Wernicke's law states, no, we will not have word end in long at positions 7 and 8 of the hexameter. But if it happens, if it occurs, if we find it, we are dealing with words that cannot be placed anywhere else within the hexametric line. It's not true. We find similar phenomena at positions 2 and 4, and not just at positions 8 within the hexameter. And at the same time, we find that at times the positions 11 and 12 at the end of the hexameter are influenced by the phonological start of the next line, instead of being fully metrically indifferent or rhythmically indeterminate. So there is something more going on, and we have to look for such clues to find an answer to the question where to pause, or if you like, where to find a moment to be silent for a second or two.
It's a very fascinating hypothesis. I'm very curious to read, your book about all these matters. But perhaps we can sort of leave the floor to someone else if there are more questions, for Ronald on any point. Obviously, comparative questions are very welcome, because one of the things that we'd like to see is also how, this system of pauses and silence functions, in different verse systems and in different, cultures. So, is there any question for Ronald?
Especially so, because it would be nice, of course, to be able to compare phenomena in Homer, or what we think that we find in Homer, with text types where it is not so unclear where to pause or why to pause. Because in Homer, of course, the first is totally unclear where to pause, and the second is, well, only a theory for now. Yeah. Why to pause? Yeah.
Right, so any question? Okay, so James,
your question.
Go ahead, unmute yourself.
Oh, thanks very much. That was, really fascinating. I wondered if you had any thoughts about whether, obviously, different meters make a difference, a huge difference as well, but how the sorts of things you're talking about would transfer or not to stanzaic poetry, particularly in Greek. So thinking about sort of, what I was thinking about was just off the top of my head would be the Pindaric odes, and how usually the strophes end at a sort of a sense break, but there are quite a few exceptions to that, and
yes,
so and presumably therefore at those points there's not going to be a pause, but the stanzaic arrangement would seem to encourage one by default.
Yeah, true.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for that. I would first say that it remains important, of course, to distinguish between the quantitative poetry and the isosyllabic poetry, or roughly, if you want, the aeolic meters and all the others. And the reason why I start by saying that is that if we look at, for example, Dionysius' comments on how to make pause or silence in the performance of poetry, euphonies, to make it sound to make it sound nice, he says that there is a clear preference for word final long syllables, and thereby for masculine pauses, so to say. The masculine pause with a pre-pause, a long syllable, and the feminine pause, of course, with a short pre-pausal syllable. But statements like those, saying that there is a preference for a pre-pausal long syllable, is, of course, in itself a quantitative observation. And it may not pertain, only for that reason, to isosyllabic poetry, like the Aeolic meters. What we do find in the Aeolic meters, and this may be an interesting thing to point out, what we do find in the Aeolic meters is that at times the rhythmical realization of lines seems to be different than the metrical surface structure. And what I mean by that is that, for example, in Pindar, we find lines where dactylic word shapes or dactylic word ends are emphasized or are brought to the fore by cleverly located pauses, or at least opportunities for pauses. And this happens actually rather frequently, that we find, especially in isosyllabic poetry, rhythmical patterns that are not identical to the metrical surface structure. You have a metrical surface structure that you may analyze based on the phonology, and you have a rhythmical structure that is different, but that must have come out in performance. Phenomena like épique bloqué and métarrhythmicis, dovetailing, are, well, the examples of such diverging metrical and rhythmical patterns. So I'm not sure that I will be able to use the criteria that I have used to look for pause based on phonetics in Stygic quantitative poetry on isosyllabic poetry. And my first feeling would be I cannot. And this, of course, interrelates with the well-known fact, and this may be something that you are also busy with, that much of the isosyllabic poetry, particularly Pindar's, is not so easily analyzed when it comes to metrical surface structure. And I will not, of course, be the first, and I will not be the last to claim that a label like dactylo-epitrite poetry is not a very good synonym for logoedic poetry, which I would say it is. But maybe one day, I'm not ready yet, but maybe one day, phonetic considerations may even help us in isosyllabic poetry to reorganize the colometry of, for example, and I know, of course, that this will get me a few comments at least, of Pindar's poetry.
Thanks very much. Yeah,
thanks, James.
Yeah, I look forward to that work.
We've got Bernardo now.
Yes, hi, and
hi.
Thanks a lot, Ronald. Was great. I'm really impressed about the amount of work this must have required. So I think we can agree that the main problem with the hexameter is how to how semantics, rhythm, and meter intersect, right? Because there seems to be not overall consistent dovetailing of these. And
that's correct.
Right. So you were asking about other other traditions. And I think that you might want to have a look at what Semitic poetry has to say, because there you do get fairly often with these sort of by these responsion between the two halves of the poetic line. You do get a pretty nice overlapping between rhythm and meaning, right? And semantic unit. The problem there, at least for those who, like me, come from a classics background, is that it's not at all clear what happens with the meter. Right? We don't have any structures that we can read in the text, but that might make some sense to look at for you. On that note, I think that one aspect that might make life a bit easier is the overlap that you get between semantic structure, rhythm, and meter with the formulae. Of course, as Ilman Ari so in a rather systematic way. So what do you make of that, and how that fits into your ideas about the prehistory of the hexameter?
Yes, thank you, Bernardo. I will start with your last point, and then you said something else that I would like to comment on. First, your last point, the formula, because of course we know a lot about them, and we think that we know roughly how they work and the economy of the formulae and well, etc. 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 An interesting issue there is that the phenomenon that I referred to earlier, Wernicke's law, does seem to have an effect on formula, in a well-known formula, like Boop Spodnia hele, for example. Wernicke's law does not have to be brought forward, despite the fact that you do have what might turn out as a premature verse end word ending, and there are a few other examples of these formula that do seem to run counter to all these bridges and these zeugmata that we need to keep the hexameter running until its full course, without a premature verse end like word end anywhere halfway the line. So yes, the formula do have a function here, and it would be worth our while to gather all the examples. I mean, I have the Boopis one now ready for you, but I would have to look up the others. And what you said about the way meter, rhythm, and syntax, semantics work together and do seem to follow similar patterns. An interesting example, I think, and a difficult one for that, is the organization of some of the choral passages from Attic drama, where you find, on the one hand, a reasonable correspondence between rhythm, meter, and in this case, well, there is not much syntax, but there is, of course, a lot of semantics we find choral passages built up of word groups that seem to be units of meaning, and at the same time, these units of meaning more or less define our metrical analysis of the choral passage itself. It's of course the other way around. It would be better if we did know for sure what the metrical analysis of the choral passage ought to be, and only then start asking ourselves questions like, does this correspond, or does it not, with semantics or with the syntax in these lines? Fortunately, of course, most choral passages that we have, with the exclusions of epodes, have their mirror image. We have a strophe and an antistrophe, and that helps us, of course, to come closer to what the metrical surface structure appears to be, but we cannot be 100% sure. But if we are looking for passages where meter, rhythm, and semantics seem to be working together fairly well, I would say we do have them. And at the same time, I must say, I am not versed enough in Semitic poetry. And so I will have to look that up. Thank you for that. Thank you for your suggestion.
Thank you very much. We have still 10 minutes, so we have time for either, probably 2 short questions. So is there anyone who wants to ask something else to? Right, Flaminia.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, thank you very much. That was very impressive, and as Bernardo said, yeah, I must admit I couldn't follow everything because my background is in ancient Chinese, and I work in Chinese manuscripts. And while you were talking, I was thinking of sort of similar punctuation strategies that we have in ancient Chinese poetry. I don't study ancient Chinese poetry. I'm not kind of an expert in that, but we have two main kinds of Chinese of poetry in ancient Chinese. And ancient Chinese is very vague, I know, but it's mostly like between the 9th century BC and the late 4th BC. And these are like the shi, the more structured one, and the fu or ci, which are like, well, more fu, which are the less structured. And in the less structured, we have this particle, which in Chinese we pronounce it, in modern Chinese it's pronounced xi, and it's supposed to be sai. So you read a few characters, and then there's a C, which is supposed to be a pause, so possibly a silence, and then there are other 4 or 5 characters, so it's not regular. The verse is not regular. While in the other kind of type of poetry, we have 4 syllables, and in Chinese each character is a syllable, and most of the time each character is a word, so 80 to 90% of the time. And this is very well structured. And since, again, I work with manuscripts, there is a very fascinating corpus of manuscripts which has been recently published, the Andashi. And so it's the manuscript version of the classic of the songs, and you have, and it's very clear that on the so it's written on bamboo strips, and it's very clear that there is a punctuation mark every 4 characters. And so I was just thinking if you have a similar sort of visual punctuation mark in, manuscript versions of Homer. Thanks.
Fascinating indeed. Well, in the manuscripts of the texts of, for example, the Iliad and the Odyssey, We do find the written punctuation marks, since the manuscripts themselves are not so very old. The most important for the Iliad, for example, is roughly 1,000 years old, whereas of course,
so it's not old at all.
no, it's actually too recent.
Yeah.
Especially if you consider that the poem itself must have been written down for the first time some 2,800 years ago.
Yeah.
So what we have is, or maybe severely smoothed over. And we do, of course, have a few fragments from manuscripts and especially papyri that are much older. We have papyri of short passages from Homer, or even single words or 2 lines that date back to the 3rd or the 2nd century BC. And so what we find there brings us closer to what the text looked like in antiquity. And now the trouble is that the first really serious comments on the punctuation of the text stem from the 4th century AD. And there's of course a lot in between, and what exactly happened in between must have had to do with organizing the way oral texts were transferred to a written format, and finding, of course, the means in writing, the signs, to make it readable. Now we know, of course, now we know for sure that the Iliad was still performed in the 1st century BC. But what happened after that, we do not really know. We tend to think that performance might still have taken place. We tend to think that reading, especially in the 1st, 6th centuries AD, was still reading aloud, either to oneself or to a listening audience, rather than reading silently. And of course, as long as there is no need to read silently, or if you do not possess the skills to read silently, there is not so much use for signs, punctuation, or otherwise that guide you during this process of reading silently. So we cannot be sure how silence or pause was punctuated or indicated otherwise in very, very early manuscripts. Now, there is a reason to believe, and this is something that I heard you say as well. Now, there is a reason to believe that the abundant use of particles in ancient Greek, and not just in Homer, but in various types of prose texts as well. Plato, for example, who uses a lot of particles, may have something to do with similar issues. Particles in Greek, especially enclitic particles, so particles that are attached to the right side of the word to demarcate the word at its completion, may have a similar function. They may work like the particles or the sounds, actually, they are not more than sounds, that we use to indicate that we have reached the end of our word group or of our utterance. We have certain sounds too, and melodies going with them to indicate to our hearers where we are in the sentence and whether or not this is a suitable moment for them to interrupt. So maybe the particles should be explored first by us, because we do not have the signs like the ones that you mentioned for archaic Chinese poetry, unfortunately.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Yeah, I guess we reached the end of our meeting. There could be time for a very short question, but We're basically almost at quarter past. So I guess if there are no very short questions, we can just call it a day. And please join me in thanking Ronald for this very fascinating presentation. We're very grateful to have you as our first speaker. We will have our next meeting on the 5th of November. There'll be a presentation by Dr. Cariddi on silence in ancient Egyptian wisdom literature. And thank you very much, Ronald. Thanks to all of you for the very interesting discussion.
Thank you.
Thanks again.